Yeah, the tightropes concept is something it's a little bit. I've been thinking about it through the lens of the evolutionary metaphor of what we are, the schism between the perception of stability and the reality of extreme contingency, if that makes sense. So, in our everyday life, we are. I kind of like to look at it as evolution and the processes that have given rise to us have given us this powerful gyroscope that we carry with us as we walk upon this tightrope. And we don't realize that we're on the tightrope above a 10,000 foot chasm
Mm.
because the gyroscope is so finely tuned.
Hmm.
But it doesn't take much in terms of if you're willing to go there, and this is one reason why I think people have such profound experiences with psychedelics, because that is one way of observing just how easily the system can be perturbed and the extreme potential disorientation that entails from even slight distortions of that gyroscopic stabilization. And so it's almost kind of like, you'll have these moments. And the reason I kind of like to think about that through that individual lens, because I also think society is starting to have these moments where we're on the tightrope. We don't realize we're on the tightrope, but the gyroscope is starting to glitch out, right? And it glitches out and it stops working momentarily. And we get this sense of, extreme dizziness or fear of heights in terms of like starting to realize just how deep the chasm beneath us is if the gyroscope were to begin malfunctioning in a way that is more chaotic than it already is trending towards. And I think I kind of look at like Trump like that. Trump is this glitch in the gyroscopic stabilization mechanism,
Yeah.
and it's giving some people extreme panic reactions to the realization of just how fragile a system, um, just how fragile reality can become if certain if certain assumptions are violated repeatedly and we push over one of those thresholds, like in the same kind of way when we're talking about the complex system of the climate environment. It's like, you start bumping up against these thresholds, and even though all behavior before that was relatively linear and mapped pretty well to human intuition, and we could tell this linear story of history, when you start bumping up against a phase transition or a potential bifurcation point, things stop making sense in any type of linear narrative. And when that happens, then the bifurcation point is kind of like the left or right looking down over the wire, 10,000 feet down. And like you don't want to necessarily um, fall off on either side. And the question becomes, how do you maintain the illusion of that narrative, or even the narrative? How do you maintain linearity, or at least some sort of coherence?
Uh,
Um,
the word some sort of coherence, and in this case, I'm going to put sovereignty back into the vocabulary. It's how do you
mhm.
maintain sovereignty?
Okay.
So there's a
All right.
couple. There's like I think three distinct things here that are all separate and interesting. So the one is the gyroscope, and when I'm going to talk about that, I'm going to talk about that using the language we used earlier in terms of this uh, unconscious intelligence or stack. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so and walking on a tightrope is perfect. I mean, think about it. A 1 year old can't walk on a floor.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the beginning of the stack, is the actual building of the capacity to walk, balance, awareness, perception, kinesthetics. Um, by the time you get to the point where you're capable of walking on a tightrope, all of that shit is being run in the unconscious, meaning it's
Yep.
being run in a domain of intelligence that you don't have to have any conscious control over at all. So you end up having this real significant, gigantic intelligence that is acting as an unconscious gyroscope that your conscious volition and perception, which is itself minuscule, um, relies on.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, there's another aspect. To the degree to which that is entirely unconscious, and your consciousness becomes aware of the vastness of that for which it is in fact responsible, If it forgets that it's not responsible, then it gets terrified. Right? So this is the, you look when you're rock climbing and you look down, or you're walking on the tightrope and you suddenly become aware of the fact you're walking on the tightrope. Consciousness takes itself as taking responsibility for the vastness of the thing it's trying to do, i.e., losing track of the fact that it is just the tiniest trim tab on top of by definition, equivalently vast capacity. Otherwise, you wouldn't be even in this position of tightrope walking. Then it falls into immediate overwhelm. Now, this is a serious fucking problem, because if it falls into overwhelm, then the third characteristic arises, which is the well-functioning of this stack, of this gyroscope, is itself very delicate. And so if and as consciousness falls into some form of overwhelm, we can do this very neurologically. If you get scared, then actually the neurological is very, very easy, right? If your prefrontal cortex begins the process of telling a story that indicates that the situation you're dealing with is mythopoetically overwhelming, then paradoxically, your adrenal system will actually respond to that story as if it's a real phenomenon, and kick your brain into adrenal and amygdala hijack, which actually restrict blood flow and neurological override out of the prefrontal cortex, radically collapsing your actual capacity full stop. And so you end up with this really interesting problem that, and this I think is the reason why I've actually been so interested in the stuff that, say, Jordan Peterson is doing, or at least the space that he is indicating is a place to look at. Which is, I think, a place that I spent a lot of, I wrote my essay on sovereignty is about this primarily. And this is how our metaphorical tightrope walker operates. You are suspended over an enormous abyss. And you can only do what you can do. And there's a very large amount of what you might do that will reduce your ability to do what you can do.
So maybe we should connect the dot, because I think there's a lot of structural parallels between the process you just outlined of looking down without the realization that the capacity to bring yourself to the point at which you even had the ability to look down in the first place implies more irrelevance than relevance with respect to that perception of that acute perception of anxiety or fear in that moment.
Right.
And I think that may be also precisely what we're talking about, or what I was trying to communicate with respect to the emerging disconnect in the mode of being on social media.
Yeah, I think that's dead right.
But just at the collective scale of the collective organism acting in that way.
That's really neat. So the implication would be that, that's really interesting. I think that's actually awesomely right. So here's the way it's feeling to me.